Hey friends, welcome back to the Horror Trans Podcast. My name is Stephanie Bree. I'm a transgender woman and I talk about all things horror. And I do apologize, I got really bogged down with work stuff last week because they moved me back to full time and shuffled my schedule around. So I just forgot to do an episode last week, so I do apologize for that. This won't be an extra long episode, but it'll probably be a little longer than I've done in the past because I want to make up for it, and I got a lot to get through because I got some new news and trailers to watch and things like that, which I really should have my headphones, but I don't. And I've watched a lot of movies in the last 2 weeks. Some of them I've already reviewed. Some of them the reviews are coming soon. So I'll just kind of run down everything I watched in the last couple of weeks. Obviously Megan, X, Thanksgiving, I've already done reviews of those. TMNT 2, Secret of the Ooze. Transformers the movie from 1986. I usually rewatch that one a few times a year. Encino Man, that was a first rewatch for me in over 20 years. Mallrats, I just watched a couple months ago. I usually watch it 2 or 3 times a year. Little Monsters from 1989. Friday the 13th Part 4, the final chapter, which is actually, unfortunately, coming back into the discussion later in our news and rumors segment. Venom, Pearl, Millennium with Chris Christopherson, Remote Control, a movie review that is coming that you have to watch. Thank you, please. Troop Beverly Hills, Space Camp. I know it's not horror, but you need to watch Space Camp if you haven't already. It's a wonderful movie. I love it. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Daria, Scooby-Doo, and X-Men the Animated Series are the 3 cartoons I've been watching. I lost interest in TMNT. I got midway through Season 2, and the show took a nosedive. A hard nosedive in quality, and I lost interest already. So, a couple of things. It is now Pride Month. I know I haven't shaved in a few days. I do apologize for that. I don't know where the hell my razor even is. I need to find it. And then, also I launched a 4th YouTube channel. You can search Stephanie Bree Plays Retro Games, or you can just go to the tab, the community tab, or not community tab, but featured channels tab, and you can get a link to it. I've already uploaded the intro video to it on all 3 of my other channels, as well as my new channel, so it's on all 4 of my channels. So that's something I've been doing. I've been working on it. It has just taken me forever to get set up to do it. Don't want to get into the what I had to do, but it has arrived. Alright, so let's go ahead and jump into news and rumors. The very first thing we have, this is coming from Bloody Disgusting, but it's like basically on every major site. And this is the trailer for Alien Romulus. So let's go ahead and watch the trailer. Turn it down a little bit so we don't get copyright strike. And see what this is about. Okay, we got a woman sleeping in bed. We got spaceships. That turned up a little bit. Planet, yeah. Looks like a sci-fi movie. From Fede Alvarez. Director of Evil Dead, Don't Breathe. Okay. Pretty diverse cast. That's promising. And producer Ridley Scott. Oh dear. Chessburger.
What's happening? Something in the water. What do you mean there's something in the water?
Oh god, no, not underwater. We already did that with Resurrection. We don't need that shit again. God damn it. I just lost a lot of hype for this movie. I don't need a reminder of Alien Resurrection, for God's sake. Yeah, they're recycling the tagline from 1979. And the font from also 1979. So, playing on nostalgia. I don't like this screeching. Please do something. Alien Romulus. I don't know. I have mixed feelings about what I just watched. Not as hyped as I was. This one is coming from Bloody Disgusting. It says, Blumhouse bringing the, quote, My Bloody Valentine franchise back to life. It just says, Blumhouse is developing a brand new My Bloody Valentine movie. Alright, so no news really, just that Blumhouse is making a new movie. So, alright, well, okay, we'll see. This one is also from Bloody Disgusting. It says Hostile TV series in the works with Paul Giamatti set to star. Eli Roth is going to be the showrunner, I guess. It is described as a, quote, modern adaptation and elevated thriller that is also a, quote, reinvention of the horror franchise that launched in 2006 and spawned two sequels, blah, blah, blah. Giamatti will star in a key role, though character details are under wraps. Allegedly, Giamatti is quoted as being a longtime fan of the films. Alright, so if you're into Hostel, I don't know how a TV series is going to work, though. Is it going to be tame? Is it going to be toned down? I don't know. We'll see. This is Venom: The Last Dance trailer. So let's go ahead and scroll down and let's watch the trailer for the new Venom movie. See how this goes. I liked the previous two Venom movies, so... Okay, we got Eddie Brock walking around at night.
I'm giving you a chance, sweetie. Gwen.
Oh, God. There's Venom. Fighting some people. Looks like it's going to be an action-packed movie.
We're Venom! We are Venom! No. Oh, yeah, we are. You're gonna need to work on that. Delicious! You take me to all the finest places.
We always knew it was impossible. That we were alone in the universe. And it's our job to make sure that remains a secret.
Let's go get him.
So, apparently, even though the Spider-Man films do take place in the MCU, the Venom films do not. I forgot about that. Looks like there's some kind of plot involving aliens again.
coming that cannot be beaten. As long as there's
Till
life,
death do they part. Okay.
everything will end.
You may not make it out of this alive, buddy.
Eddie, the time has come.
I'm gonna puke. Not because of the trailer.
Be honest, I mean, how fast do you think you can get that thing to go without killing it?
Only one way to find out.
Oh, damn. We got a Venom horse. Ugh. Alright, that looks interesting. Could be a good capstone to a pretty good trilogy from what I've seen so far. Alright, this is also from Bloody Disgusting. Bill Skarsgård to return as Pennywise in Welcome to Derry. So the HBO Max series Welcome to Derry will be bringing the familiar face, blah blah blah. The upcoming series will premiere sometime in 2025, and it will be a prequel to the two Stephen King It movies from Andy Muschietti. Skarsgård is set to star in and executive produce. The actor joins the previously announced cast of Taylor Page, Jovan Adepo, Chris Chalk, James Remar, Madeline Stowe, and Stephen Ryder. The series will begin in the 1960s in the time leading up to the events of It Part 1. Blah, blah, blah. Alright. That's pretty interesting. That looks cool. And also, I missed this last week, but we got a new trailer for Beetlejuice. So let's go ahead and pop this sucker in and watch it real quick.
Here's a preview. Be warned, it's intense.
Looks like there's a funeral. Somebody died.
Can't believe Grandpa's dead.
Death is hard.
Yeah, sometimes I think life is harder.
Warner Brothers Pictures.
When I was a teenager, a trickster demon terrorized our entire family and tried to force me to marry him. I believed he was gone forever until you found this in the attic.
Ew. Who's Beetlejuice?
Don't ever say that name.
Beetlejuice.
No, Astrid, I am serious. If you say his name 3 times, he will appear.
Beetlejuice.
The juice is loose.
I'm gonna make you so happy.
The living. The dead. Can they coexist? That's what we're here to find out.
Willem Dafoe.
Where's Beetlejuice?
Beetlejuice.
Feel free to express yourself. Don't be afraid.
You're a figment of my imagination.
Really? Is this a figment of your imagination?
Okay. It still looks fun. September 6th, one day before my birthday. So hopefully I'll get to watch it on my birthday. That's the plan anyways. Alright, that looks okay. This one is coming from iHorror.com. This is another trailer. It says Creature Feature Horror Anthology Cryptids. So let's just go ahead and Okay, 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 here we go. Let's see if we can get some information. It is a must-watch anthology, jam-packed with practical effects, blah, blah, blah. Reminiscent of a whole bunch of other movies it's ripping off, blah, blah, blah. It said there was a trailer. Where's the trailer? Oh, here we go.
You're listening to WQRK, your home for easy listening.
And welcome. It's time for everybody's favorite, the truth serum.
I'm your host from the edge of the unknown.
It's definitely
And I'm about to inject you with a little bit of
playing on nostalgia.
Today marks the beginning of the annual Mothman Festival in Point
Joe Bob
West Virginia.
from Joe Bob's Last Drive-In.
I've elected to dedicate this entire show to the theme of cryptozoology. I guess for lack of grace, we're talking about monsters tonight, everybody.
Looks pretty low budget. We'll see. I don't know. That was disappointing. That's all I got for news and rumors and trailers and shit, so let's go ahead and get into the topics. The first topic is our post-apocalyptic movies, horror. Now, obviously, like, zombie apocalypse movies would fall under horror. Resident Evil, Dawn of the Dead, etc. The Walking Dead, for sure. But I'm talking about stuff like, you know, Mad Max, or, you know, I don't know, A Boy and His Dog, or movies like that. Movies where the world has ended, or something has happened, and we're left with survivors fighting for survival. Something like The Hunger Games, or the movie Hunger Games is ripping off The Running Man. I don't know if I could say, like, blanket all post-apocalyptic movies are horror. Obviously, I would be remiss if I didn't say some of them absolutely fall under horror. But I'm just talking about the thought in general, the setting in general. Unless it's like a blatant spoof, you know, like, I don't know, like a Mel Brooks or something. The idea of a post-apocalyptic movie, they're all, you know, something happened, civilization collapsed, a virus, a disease, nuclear war, or I don't know, a disaster, like maybe, I don't know, something like The Day After Tomorrow or whatever. Maybe an alien invasion. The aliens came down, blew up our cities, and then went home. You know? I think when you set a movie in a post-apocalyptic world, regardless of genre, science fiction usually, sometimes action, drama, thriller, you're inevitably going to have some horror elements. You're going to have some type of conflict between the survivors, usually fighting over resources. You're going to have some intense scenes, probably graphic violence more often than not. You're going to have some possibly gore, although not necessarily. And oftentimes these movies have downer endings where you don't really have a resolution. You just have, well, I guess they wandered into the desert and died. I definitely think that post-apocalyptic movies are supposed to be cautionary tales. I also believe that post-apocalyptic movies are also supposed to be disturbing, and they are supposed to be downers. They're supposed to make us afraid of whatever future they're depicting, so that we do whatever we can to prevent said future from happening. But I don't know, aside from the zombie apocalypse movies that I've already mentioned, I don't know if I have seen a single, quote, post-apocalyptic movie that I would say is a straight-up horror movie, except, again, for, like, the zombie apocalypse movies. I think there's room in cinema for those stories. You know, we see movies like, you know, we watch, what's a good example? Independence Day. Now, I know they did kind of sort of do a 30 years later of Independence Day with, I think it was called Resurgence or something like that. But they could have made a film that took place, you know, the day after, to see how humanity coped with all of our major cities being destroyed overnight. And world governments and militaries coming together under a single flag to try to restore order and repel the alien invaders. I think there is room for a horror movie of sorts in that world. Obviously, Furiosa just came out. That is in the Mad Max franchise. Mad Max is one of the most famous post-apocalyptic franchises. I would definitely classify just Mad Max as like sci-fi, post-apocalyptic action thriller. And thriller is sometimes, often in fact, used as a substitute or stand-in for horror when usually somebody doesn't want to call something horror for whatever reason. Either they have a negative connotation in regards to horror, or they, you know, just are hesitant to classify everything horror for whatever reason. Maybe they have a narrow definition of what horror is. I don't know if I would classify Beyond Thunderdome, Fury Road, or The Road Warrior as horror films at all. I haven't seen Furiosa yet, so I can't comment on that. Although they definitely have horror elements in them, I would argue. All of them that I have seen. I would certainly classify the first one, the original Mad Max, as a thriller more than an action movie. And it isn't quite post-apocalyptic yet, as the franchise would become. But it is still a bleak world that he lives in. I don't know. I don't know if I have an answer to this question. I guess I could have prepared better by having more examples. But as I go through the list of movies that I know of that fall under the post-apocalyptic camp, the only ones that I can say for certain are horror are like the zombie movies. Zombie apocalypse movies. But those are obvious, right? And as I try to think of other post-apocalyptic movies, I usually come up with, like, action movies or sci-fi thrillers as the more common classification for those films. Now, if you're one of those people who rejects the term thriller and then just substitutes that as horror, you could make a case that these movies are certainly horror. I suppose that is a possibility. Oh shit. Oh, I think I closed my. I had another news story I was gonna read. Oh well, I just remembered. Oh well, we'll come back to it. Anyways, I just thought of something, but I apologize. So I think if you take too broad of a definition for post-apocalyptic movies, you'd end up calling Waterworld horror. And I don't think anyone's going to agree with that. So I think that there are going to be inherently horror elements in any post-apocalyptic movie, because you're going to have people who are fighting to survive, struggling to find resources, and probably fighting other humans for those resources, who are going to resort to murder and other extreme measures to protect the resources they claim. This is a pretty common thread in post-apocalyptic films. So I think I would stop short of saying that they're inherently horror, but they certainly have horror elements in them, I think, more often than not. But I don't really have much of a basis for this, because frankly, post-apocalyptic movies are not my cup of tea, and they're not generally movies I enjoy watching. So I have kind of limited experience outside the zombie genre, which I would say are certainly horror for sure. So I guess I don't really have necessarily a definitive answer, just a sort of, I suppose they can be, or at the very minimum, likely have some horror elements. At the bare minimum. So I would say, yeah, I guess not. I guess they're not necessarily horror, per se. Next up, how important are characters, as in fully developed characters, in horror movies? A lot of times, especially when it comes to slashers, the common criticism that is lobbed at horror movies, and again, especially slashers, is they're wooden characters, or they're caricatures. They're not fully fleshed out. And fans of cinema in general, especially those who look down on horror outside of the so-called, quote, elevated horror, generally tend to thumb their noses at movies that don't have, quote, developed characters. Now, obviously, if you're trying to tell a narrative and you have a well-defined plot and a story, you should have well-defined characters. And one of the prerequisites for a plot to be considered coherent and complete, your main character, whoever they are, should go through some sort of change. This is at least the academic requirement for something considered a plot. But not all horror movies are intended to be high art. You know, not all movies are intended to be high art. That doesn't mean they don't have no value at all. You know, I mean, a coloring book, a kid who takes their crowns and colors in the pages of a coloring book, that's still art. It's just not the same thing as a Picasso or a Rembrandt or whatever. You know what I mean? So horror movies are still films. They're still cinema. They're just not necessarily, you know, artistic cinema per se, or should I say, you know, well, by and large, you know, Oscar-worthy cinema as a measure. But they're not supposed to be. They're literally Pulp Fiction. That's what they're classified as. Horror movies, sci-fi movies, blockbusters, even your comedies in general are classified as Pulp Fiction. Which is to say they really aren't supposed to have, you know, narrative themes and, you know, well-defined plots or, you know, fully fleshed out characters. Those are not necessarily prerequisites for a horror film to be effective as a horror film. That's not to say a horror film can't or shouldn't have these things. Obviously, if a horror movie has these things, it's going to garner praise for that. But it's not necessary, I don't believe. I think having something of a plot is more important than bothering with fleshing out the characters. Especially in a high cast, high body count slasher movie, which is, again, what I usually talk about on this channel. So let's analyze a couple examples. In the slasher genre or subgenre, you have the trope of what we refer to as the final girl. And a lot of times people will critique their final girl on how effective she or he or they were as a character. As in how well defined was the character and how much agency did they have in surviving the events of the film. Was it just blind luck? Or did they do something to outsmart the killer? Or what have you? So these are things people often bring up when they're critiquing their favorite or lesser favorite final girls. And I'm using final girl as sort of shorthand for all, you know, basically final characters, final boy, whatever. Because that's the trope. That's what it is colloquially referred to as. So, you get your common examples like Laurie Strode from the Halloween franchise, Nancy Thompson from the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. You know, those two come up a lot. Sidney Prescott from the Scream franchise gets brought up a lot. And you hear people who refer to slasher characters as basically, quote, cannon fodder for the serial killer. You know, they're just there to pad the body count. And you also have what's known as the asshole trope, where the characters are intentionally vague and intentionally unlikable so that you're okay with them dying and actually rooting for the killer to dispatch them in horrific ways. This is somewhat of a criticism of the slasher genre. The asshole trope is sometimes regarded as lazy writing, as like, oh, just make the character a total douchebag, and you'll be happy that you'll be happy when they get decapitated. Instead of, in the example of Friday the 13th Part 4, the final chapter, where you have Crispin Glover's character, who's actually quite likable, and you're really sad when he dies, because you were kind of rooting for him, and he got kind of a throwaway death. You're kind of disappointed. But then you have characters like, you know, the nameless, faceless assholes from Friday the 13th Part 3, where literally every one of them, you're like, when the fuck is it your turn to die? And you're just counting the seconds until you get that satisfied blood splatter. So, are characters important to horror movies? I'm going to say it depends on the horror movie. Are they important to a psychological thriller? Yes. Are they important to a serial killer teen slasher? No, not necessarily. Maybe the final girl, but not even then. Are they important to, like, a haunted house film? Probably, but again, not necessarily. Not important at all. Like, literally at all. In a creature feature, again, you're rooting for the monster. Godzilla or Tremors or whatever. So you're kind of like, you know, yeah, you want the main character to survive, but you're good with everybody else dying in general. But you don't always have a singular protagonist or main character. You don't even always have a singular final girl, even in slasher movies, even in Halloween. Because Dr. Loomis survived at the end of Halloween as well, and he was a central figure in the film. So why does Laurie Strode get all the attention? I don't fucking know. Y'all know how I feel about that goddamn movie. So whatever. I don't know. I guess, by and large, it really depends on the film. You know? Are movies better or more enjoyable when you have fleshed out, developed characters that are believable as human beings? Again, I would say not necessarily, you know? Let's take, for example, Nightmare on Elm Street. As a whole, in general, by and large, the franchise usually does a good job spending enough time developing the characters and giving you time to get to know them and understand their hopes and dreams and fears and whatnot. At least the first 4 films do a really good, solid job of this. I believe the original and part 3 do it the best. Obviously, they do pretty much everything the best. They're the 2 best in the franchise. Freddy's Revenge does a pretty good job of establishing the characters, although it's still ambiguous what in the fuck was going on with Jesse and Grady. Were they friends? Were they lovers? Was it bully and bullied? I don't know. It's not very fucking clear in that movie. But they're still fairly fleshed out characters, all things considered. And then you get to Dream Child, where it's like, comic book nerd hates blood. Rich bitch has anorexia. Jock dies in car crash. You don't really know shit about the characters at all, because they're not characters. They're just basically victims. So, those are still enjoyable films. You know what I mean? I don't necessarily believe characters, especially ancillary or side characters, are all that important to a horror film. The main character, the protagonist, or the final girl, if you will, depending on what genre of horror you're watching, might be important as a character. But again, I don't think it's a necessity. A lot of horror movies have ensemble casts, and a lot of times they have such huge casts, so many characters to get to know, you don't have enough time to get to know any of them. There's even horror movies, even slasher movies, where you really don't spend enough time with the so-called final girl to really be rooting for her. You're just kind of like, oh, you're the one that survived? I thought you were going to die 30 minutes ago. So, I don't really think it's necessary at all in some cases. Now, is a movie better or more enjoyable if the characters are likable? Again, I'm going to say not necessarily, but it depends. You know, the characters are fully fleshed out and fully defined in The Dream Warriors, Nightmare on Elm Street 3. That is certainly a more enjoyable film than The Dream Child for most people. Now, fair warning, I guess, or to be fair, I should say, The Dream Child was the very first Nightmare on Elm Street movie I saw. Or maybe the very second one, I guess. I saw part 4 on HBO free weekend, and then I rented Dream Child when it came out. But I watched 4 and then 5. I'm pretty sure. So I have a lot of nostalgia for The Dream Child. I also have a lot of nostalgia for The Dream Master as well. Most days of the week, if you ask me which one do I like most of the franchise, of the sequels, because the first one is my literal favorite movie of all time, but if you're asking me which one's my favorite of the sequels, most days, I'm just going to immediately say Dream Warriors, Part 3. Patricia Arquette, Lawrence Fishburne. You know what I mean? That's going to be my automatic default response. But then every time I watch Dream Master, I always stop and say, I don't know, maybe I like this one more. Now, we don't really spend as much time with the characters in Dream Master, and I'm going to make a point, as we do with the Dream Warriors, obviously. Especially when we throw away the survivors of the previous film in the first act of the film of the Dream Warriors, or Dream Master. Sorry, the naming conventions of these films are confusing. Part 4. But we do get enough time with at least Alice and Rick and Dan to kind of have an idea of who they are. Maybe not so much the other 2 girls who die, and I don't remember their characters' names. But we still do get enough time with the other characters that we have a little bit more than a surface level understanding of who they are. You know, we kind of understand Rick's angst. We kind of understand Alice's turmoil. We kind of understand that Dan is just a dumb jock. You know? We don't really need to know that much more about them, because we know Rick's going to die, Dan is going to be taken out of commission, and Alice is going to be left all by herself to fight Freddy on her own, and she's our alleged final girl. But if you look at something like, let's take a look at Scream 6. That movie is such a convoluted mess. You assume Melissa Barrera or Jenna Ortega, one or the other, is going to be the final girl. But also, there's so many characters in that movie that you're trying to follow, and storylines that you're trying to tie up, that you're like, I don't know, it could be this one, it could be that one, maybe they're going to subvert expectations, or I don't know. So much going on. Now, just to bring it back, I would say that, and I don't remember their characters' names, but the character Melissa Barrera plays and the character Jenna Ortega plays in Scream 6 is a little more fleshed out than your average slasher movie character. But that's only because they were, you know, the main characters across 2 films. We got a considerable more amount of time with them than we did with most slasher characters. A lot of times you get like maybe 10 to 15 minutes where the character is even in the movie, and they're not even in every scene of that 10 to 15 minutes. They're just kind of sort of there for their, you know, one-liner or whatever their one trait is. They go off, they get killed, and then you move on to the next one. Now you'll notice on my channel, what are the slasher movies I bitch about the most? Halloween, Prom Night, Happy Birthday to Me, which I forgot to mention at the top of the show, I did watch this past week as well. Or I should say, tried to fucking watch and fell asleep. Jesus Christ, that was boring as fucking sin. So I guess that's why I didn't put it on the goddamn list. These are 3 movies that think they're something they're not. In other words, they're trying to have a story. They're trying to flesh out the characters and give you time to get to know them and spend time with them doing regular, normal, everyday things. Popping popcorn, or carving pumpkins, or disco dancing, or whatever the fuck it is. Which you would think might ought to make a more interesting film, right? You're spending time with the characters. But you're not spending time with the killer actually killing. So these movies tend to be boring to me. So here you have a movie, Halloween 1978, prime example, where Laurie Strode is probably, at least in that first movie, the most fleshed out of a final girl until you get to Sidney Prescott. Nancy Thompson is pretty well fleshed out, I guess, in Nightmare on Elm Street 1984, but also she's kind of your stereotypical girl next door. Not a lot of depth. I know a lot of people love Nancy and love to put her up on a pedestal, but let's be real, she really just kind of sort of stumbles into it. Really. You know, yeah, she's kind of a survivor, but she's not like, you know, I mean, what do we know about her? Her mom's a drunk, her dad's a cop, her boyfriend's a jock, her best friend is dead, her best friend's boyfriend is dead, and her boyfriend's about to die. We don't really get to know that much about Nancy. We really don't. We know she's friends with Tina, but we don't know how close of friends they are. Is Tina her best friend? Or is Tina just the girl she was walking to school with that day? We don't know. They don't give us enough information. What are Nancy's other hobbies? Or what are her hobbies? We know she was watching Evil Dead on TV, trying to stay awake. But that could just be a movie that was on TV and she was just watching it because that's what was on, and she needed some stimulation to keep her brain active. That does not tell us she's a horror fan. It just tells us that she was trying to stay awake. We know she drinks coffee, but we don't know if that's a personality trait of Nancy or a survival trait she develops as she starts to figure out sleeping is dangerous. But what do we really actually know about Nancy Thompson from 1984 Elm Street? Honestly, not as much as we pretend to think. We really don't. We know she's kind of sort of dating the boy next door, Glenn, who is an athlete, allegedly, or she calls him a jock at one point in the movie. But we don't know anything about him, even. We know he's allegedly a jock. He's got a somewhat trusting mom, I guess, who lets him stay at his cousin's house or something like that. We know he's not depicted as very intelligent, but we don't know that for sure, because when we look at the situations he's put in, you know, it could just be, hey, he doesn't know how to fucking react. He's a kid, honestly. But what else do we know about Nancy? Literally, what do we know about Nancy? What do we know about her? Does she go to church? We don't know. We know she has a cross on her wall. Or we don't even know that, because that's Tina's bedroom. So we know Tina has a cross on her wall. So that doesn't tell us anything about Nancy. We don't even know if Nancy's a virgin. We don't. We assume, because she refuses to have sex with Glenn in that one scene, well, actually 2 scenes, but based on Glenn's reaction, he kind of had the assumption they were gonna have sex, which implies they probably previously have had sexual relations. We don't know that at all. We assume Nancy is headstrong, but we don't really see evidence of that. We see that she is, you know, angry and terrified of Freddy, and angry and terrified of her parents. We see that she is, you know, disappointed in Glenn's behavior. She doesn't even really mourn Tina that much. She doesn't mourn Rod hardly at all, or Glenn, really. Now you could argue she's under duress and doesn't really have time to mourn them. But when she's lying in bed, hearing the voices in her head replay her memories from the film, we hear Glenn's voice. And we don't see her shed a tear or anything. We see her in the dream pick up Glenn's headphones, and she just kind of makes a face and drops them. She doesn't cry or shed a tear or give us a look of emotion at all. So what do we really know about Nancy? Dick all. We know dick all about Nancy. And yet she's heralded as one of the greatest final girls of all time. And it's like, well, is she? Now let's go back to Laurie Strode. We know Laurie Strode is a babysitter. Well, that's a little bit more than we know about Nancy. Does Nancy babysit? We don't know. Does she have hobbies or an after-school job? We don't know. But we know Laurie Strode does. We know that Laurie Strode's dad is a realtor, and he entrusts her to drop off the keys at the Myers house. So we know she is at least marginally responsible and somewhat trustworthy, especially if she's going to be entrusted to the care of another person's child and a babysitter. So we can at least assume she's somewhat responsible. We can't even make that assumption about Nancy because we see no evidence that she's responsible at all. She falls asleep in English class and then has a psychotic freak out. She falls asleep intentionally to go looking for Freddy Krueger in the dream world, knowing he's dangerous, and then almost dies when he catches up to her. We know that she finds a book on booby traps, essentially, and sets up a couple of booby traps, but at the same time, she also, doesn't really do much else. But what else do we know about Laurie? We know she has somewhat of a negative opinion of horror films and comic books based on the tone and words she uses when she reprimands Tommy for reading comic books or watching horror movies. We know she's not necessarily popular because we see her with a pseudo-popular chick and a couple of, we would argue, cheerleader-type girls who are kind of making fun of her for being a nerd. Now, we can't assume if she's popular or not based on that context clue, but we can assume she's at least likable. Her friends are ribbing her, but they're not bullying her, which means they probably respect her. Now, we see no evidence whatsoever that Nancy's friends trust her or respect her. Rod threatens her. Glenn dismisses her and gaslights her. Tina kind of, sort of, doesn't even really interact with Nancy that much. They have a couple of moments, I guess, but Nancy doesn't even really answer Tina's questions, and she doesn't even really, offer Tina support or advice. She just kind of, sort of is there. So we don't even know if Nancy is popular. We don't know if she has other friends outside of Tina and Glenn. We don't even know if she's even a friend of Rod or not. We literally know none of this. We know Laurie doesn't have a boyfriend because she wants Ben Tramer to ask her to the dance. I have a point. Bear with me. I promise I'm making a point. We know that Laurie, we know that she, we do know that she can drive, and we know that she can smoke, we know that she does smoke weed. and we know that she has romantic aspirations to go to the dance and be romantic, but we also know that she's shy and freaks out when her friend tells her Ben Tramer is taking her, because she didn't want Ben Tramer to know that she had a crush on him. So we can assume she's shy. So we know a lot about Laurie Strode in the 65 or so minutes we get to spend with her before Michael shows up to terrorize her. We don't know that much about Nancy. But Nancy's a more interesting character because we don't need to know shit about Nancy. We know she kicks Freddy's ass, and that's all that fucking matters. Laurie doesn't even kick Michael's ass. She kinda sort of escapes him, and then Loomis shows up, pumps him full of bullets, and then she throws her head into Loomis's shoulder and cries until the credits roll. She's not very headstrong. She doesn't do shit. In Halloween 2, she lies in the hospital bed the entire goddamn movie, crying like a little girl. She's dead in Halloween 4, 5, and 6. And a totally, completely rewritten character from there on. From H2O on. So that's a different Laurie Strode. The point I'm trying to make is Halloween 1978 spends a lot more time developing Laurie Strode as a character than Nightmare on Elm Street 1984 does with Nancy. And yet Nancy's the more interesting character. The more memorable character. Now Laurie Strode would become a horror icon as Jamie Lee Curtis became a Scream Queen and Laurie was reinvented in future films. But if they had just made Halloween 1978 and no sequels, nobody would remember Laurie Strode or Michael Myers. That movie would have been done, forgotten by now. So, no, we don't need, that's the point I'm trying to say, we don't really need to spend that much time developing and fleshing out the final girl or any character of a slasher movie when we know they're just going to end up dying or escaping anyways. You know, I don't remember her character's name, but PJ Souls in Halloween is way more fleshed out as a character than Tina, Glenn, Rod, and Nancy combined. And yet, Tina, Glenn, and Nancy, of the three, Rod's not that interesting, but of the three, are fairly interesting characters, Nancy being the most interesting. And again, we are kind of rooting for Tina, and we assume she's the final girl. And then she dies, and then we're like, oh shit, what's going on? We don't have any aspirations or expectations that PJ Souls is the final girl in Halloween. We know she's going to get killed. We just don't know how or when. But again, we know way, and I'm not gonna go through the bullet points. I've already made my point. But we know way more about PJ Souls' character, even though I can't remember her character's name at the moment. Hello, kitty cat. We know more about her than we do Nancy, and Nancy's still a more interesting character. The point is, it's not necessary to flesh out your characters in a horror movie. Because even when they do take the time to do so, sometimes it just bogs down the movie. The Conjuring is my last example. The Conjuring is one of the scariest, most well-defined and well-polished and well-respected haunted house horror movies ever made. Every single one of the characters in that movie is more or less interchangeable with every other character. You don't remember none of their names, or personalities, or who's who, or what's what, or who is doing what. None of it. It's not important. You got the girls, the parents, the investigators. You don't remember any details about the mom. You just remember she's the mom. You don't remember any details about any of the individual girls. You just remember, oh, that one gets kidnapped and that one sleepwalks, and that's all I remember. Names, personalities, blank slate. Nothing comes to mind. Even the Warrens, really the only thing you know is Papa Warren's an asshole and Mama Warren's kind of a psychic, and you don't really get much else. You know nothing about Dad other than he's absent or avoiding what's going on at home. And yet The Conjuring still works as one of the greatest highly respected horror movies of all time. And none of the characters are fully fleshed out or fully defined. So even in a, quote, elevated horror movie that has the respect of the so-called cinemaphile, doesn't have fleshed out characters. Again, I'm going to argue they're not necessary. At all. My last topic is, are there too many public domain horror movies? And I'm going to save this topic for another day because it's getting late and I need to wrap this up, and I'm just over an hour long. So I'm going to leave that as a question. Leave a comment down below. Are there too many public domain horror movies? What I mean by that is movies based on public domain franchises like Popeye, Winnie the Pooh, etc. Although they haven't done a Popeye horror movie yet, you know they will. Anyways, stay cool. See you sometime in the future.